This evening, travels in Patagonia. Of all my geography classes, I most remember informal ones spent in front of the TV during the 10 weeks of the Falklands conflict in 1982. Portsmouth, Southampton and Gibraltar all took on a new significance and nearness. Ascension Island's smallness and remoteness gave way to its importance. The contours of the South Atlantic Ocean began to form in my mind. I could picture South Georgia and the Falkland Islands on the map. When the first wave of Harrier jump jets were sent against the Argentine positions in Port Stanley, I learned the importance of a capital, even though it wasn't a city. The South Atlantic winds sweeping the deck of an aircraft carrier formed the backdrop for those enduring words of the relatively unknown reporter at that time, Brian Hanrahan. I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them out and I counted them all back. And as engagement with the RGs began, places with evocative names became familiar to me. Tumbledown Mountain, Pebble Island, Two Sisters, and Wireless Ridge. The brutality of war was mitigated by such romantic names as Bluff Cove and Goose Green. They could have been drawn straight from an Arthur Ransom, Swallows and Amazons. I learned a new word following the yump from San Carlos Waters along the Moody Brook track to Stanley. But beyond the war, South America has always held a fascination for me with its vastness and its the pampas grasslands, the exploration of Patagonia by the Spaniards, the search for a safe passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific through Tierra del Fuego to avoid the dangers of Cape Horn, and then the later British charting of those Magellan Straits. My sources were mainly books. Little did I think that someone from your place and mine who had travelled extensively in this uttermost part of the earth would come back to tell me the tale. But I came across one such, and I'm very happy to welcome to the Armagh Society this evening for this purpose Professor Jim McAdam and also his wife Geraldine, a fellow traveller with him in Falklands and Patagonia. Jim studied at Queen's University Belfast, obtaining a degree in agriculture. He first went to the Falklands in 1976 as part of a three-person team to set up an agricultural research station in this remote British overseas territory. In 1979, after spending 6 months driving a Land Rover up through 5 South American countries, he returned home. Working for the Department of Agriculture as an agricultural researcher in grassland management and upland management, he started researching how to make farming more environmentally friendly whilst retaining an economically viable farming model. He was involved in an important agroforestry trial begun in the 1990s at nearby Loughgall, the National Network Silvopasture Experiment. Silvopastoralism is the combining of widely spaced trees and grazing livestock on an integrated grassland. From this work was formed the Agroforestry Forum, of which Jim became the director. Jim was elected a Fellow of the Royal Agricultural Society in 2005. He is chairman of the Agricultural History Society of Ireland and a member and former vice president for Ulster of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland. For some years he has been the Irish representative of the Hacklet Society And in 2014, he was awarded an OBE for his contribution to agriculture and research in the Falkland Islands. In 1983, just after the Falklands War, he was asked to go back to the islands temporarily to help rehabilitate the agricultural research program, and has visited on an almost annual basis since. He has visited the Falkland Islands 50 times and has built up links with the southern Chilean city of Punta Arenas in the Magellan Straits. He has travelled widely in Southern Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. Besides this, he has edited the Falkland Islands Journal for over 30 years and has published widely on the region. Currently, along with his main role in promoting the introduction of trees onto farms based on his research at Loughgall, he is working with the Falkland Islands Government and landowners on a land recovery programme to cope with the rapidly obvious impacts of climate change. So with such impressive experience, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to travels in Patagonia by Professor Jim McAdam.
My goodness, Dave, you know more about me than I know about myself after that introduction. Thank you very much indeed. It is an honour, really is an honour to come and speak to the Society. We worked out the last time I'd come here, which was, I think, 2010. And I talked on roughly the same subject, I believe. But anyway, hopefully you've all forgotten about that. And I've certainly changed it and added a good bit to it. There are a lot of things I could have spoken to you about. Falkland Islands would have been fun, and I do have to speak about that. But rarely actually do I get asked to talk about Patagonia. I nearly always get to the Falklands or bits and pieces like that. So it is really a pleasure. It was a pleasure to do the work to put this together, and it revived old memories for me and old experiences of just travelling in Patagonia. So that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight. The gathering of logos along the bottom is probably a fairly unique gathering, and they reflect maybe the interests I have in life, some of them anyway. The logo of the Hacklet Society, which you kindly mentioned, Dave, and I'll just mention a little bit about the end. Probably there might be one or two who aren't members, so I just tell you what it is. Queen's University, which I still have an honorary position in, the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, which we joined really to go on the field trips because they're just brilliant. They make the type of people you meet and the places you go all over this island and the interest in our history. And then I'm also an honorary professor at the University of Magallanes in Punta Arenas, like you talked about, so I thought I would stick that one on too. So I'm really just going to give a quick rattle through Patagonia itself, what about it, the geography of it, and so on, all details, and then sort of focus near the end of that a bit on climate change and just some of the things we've found there in relation to climate change, particularly reflecting the glaciers there in the retreat. And there's an interesting glacier which isn't retreating, and then just a wee bit at the end about my time in Patagonia, particularly finishing off with sort of an escape from the jaws of death almost, where we were in Patagonia, in a remote part of Patagonia, the fortnight before the COVID lockdown happened. We'd been in the Falklands for 5 weeks before, where nobody had heard. COVID was not an issue, to be honest, so we weren't aware what was going on in the rest of the world. And suddenly we got to Patagonia and drifted around a while, and then suddenly realised we'd better get out quick. And that will be my final little story and a bit about the Hacklet Society. So Patagonia, as Dave said, it's that the name is very evocative. You know, it's a region of the world which people don't know much about, really. It's away up the top there at the bottom of South America. And there's no country in the world called Patagonia. It's just a geographical region made up of two countries, or parts of two countries, Chile and Argentina. It's pretty big. It's about 11 times the size of Ireland in total. And as I said, it's part of those of the two countries of Chile. There, the long stringy country on the left, and Argentina, the bigger neighbour on the right. It's really the bottom southern cone, it's often called, of South America there. And it's really an area that's sort of geographically isolated by mountains and its landscape, which give it its particular peculiarity. Where does the name come from? Ferdinand Magellan, the Portuguese explorer in 1520, first went around the world. Of course, he didn't make it, but one of his ships did. When they went through what became the Magellan Straits, around the first Europeans to go around the southern tip of South America, he described the natives and people of that area, Indians of that area, as having big feet, and that is Patagones. So, and the land, Tierra de Patagones, is the land of the big feet. So that's how it became Patagonia. So they say. So I'm going to talk a bit about it now, a bit about just an overview of the geography, the climate of Patagonia, the peoples of Patagonia who are there, what they do, and then the wildlife, which is obviously impressive and quite distinctive from other parts of the earth. The species you find there and just the landscapes really are quite spectacular. First of all, the climate. It's a huge climatic range, and it's very influenced by the Andes. Two things really, and the presence of Antarctica. It's quite close, if you like, in the southern. I don't know if that pointer works. Maybe not. No. Anyway, that's just an unusual view of the Earth, looking over the South Pole, where you have the Antarctica. You have Antarctica, and then you have the southern tip of South America. Now, for example, the Falkland Islands, you can see there, are exactly the same latitude south as we are north. So Port Stanley in the Falklands is the same latitude as Cork. So in the north, it's about 52 south. But the temperature is about 5 or 6 degrees colder because 9/10 of the world's ice is in Antarctica, and that has a huge effect on the climate. If you take together all the ice from everywhere else, from the Arctic, from every mountain range, every glacier, everywhere else, it still only makes about 1/10 of the world's ice. 9/10 is in Antarctica, so it has a massive effect on the climate of the southern hemisphere. And Patagonia, that stretch, going right down, if you like, pointing towards the Antarctica, so that keeps it, number one, quite cold. And then secondly, because there's very little land in the southern hemisphere, particularly near the bottom of it, the wind just goes continuously round, and there's nothing to stop it. In the northern hemisphere, the wind is very complicated because of all the continents we have, but in the southern hemisphere, it's not. So you just get, Cape Horn is famous for its strong westerly winds, and that's just reflects what happens in Patagonia. And then you have the Andes Mountains stretching right down the side there, that big whole western chain of mountains, which really creates most of the scenery and stops almost all the rain. Land stops there, and the rest of Patagonia, the bit on the east, is bone dry. So there's over that short distance of a few, well, or maybe near 400 or 500 miles, you've a full gradient from some of one of the wettest places on Earth to some of the driest places, simply because of the Andes Mountains catch all the rain as it comes across. If you look at some of those rainfall graphs, just for interest's sake, the big spiky one on the mountains, you can see just the amount of rainfall it gets is phenomenal. When you get right across the east, there's next to none. And when you're down in right down the south, there's very little rain too on Tierra del Fuego there, and of course it's cold and much cooler than average. The geology itself is very extreme, if you like. There are a huge number of active volcanoes still in Chile. All of those red lines show a volcano, most of which are active in some way or other. So that means, because the country is on a fault line between two tectonic plates, the effect of volcanoes is quite dramatic. Most of them are completely docile, but then you do occasionally get eruptions, and some of them have been highly significant. For example, Mount Hudson, about 40 years ago or so, the dust cloud it put up completely covered the Falklands for an entire growing season and really stopped grass growth practically because of that, and a huge loss of livestock and everything just from a dust cloud from one volcano. So, it is a volatile region from that point of view, and it's not uncommon, particularly in the northern part of Patagonia. It's where most of the active volcanoes are, and we'll look at that in a bit later on. People first arrived there about 9,000 years ago. They gradually came over the Bering Strait, what is now the Bering Strait, and then down through Alaska and North America and drifted down. So it took quite a long time. It's really not that much different from when people first arrived in Ireland after the ice receded. The southern hemisphere was glaciated roughly at the same sort of time as the northern hemisphere. So people arrived down in about that time, and they formed all sorts of tribal boundaries, and particularly down in the south, where there's a very adverse climate, you got a whole range of tribes of Indians who had not really changed their lifestyle right up until about the 19th century. We had all the tribes of Indians there, and indeed now it's very unpopulated. Nowadays it still is relatively unpopulated. For example, here in Ireland, we have about 2 million people. In Patagonia, you have about 2 million people, an average of 2 per square kilometre, and now in Ireland it's 134 per square kilometre. So it gives you an idea of the different density there is. It's got a very rich geological history because of the mountains and the plants and animals that gradually migrated down there and became adapted to that. Species like the giant sloth there, the Mylodon and stuff, which there's a lot of fossils been found, and it's a very interesting area for geological exploration. And that's a statue of a giant sloth in one of the last caves that the remains were found in southern Chile. History of European discovery, and Dave once again alluded to that. Ferdinand Magellan was the first really first European to go around through the straits that were named after him. Then after that, you had the whole development of the Spanish Empire in South America, and the whole Patagonia essentially was an area that was owned or managed as part of the Spanish Empire. The first sort of note we start to see of European history, a wider European history, was of course the fact that the Beagle, Fitzroy in Darwin and the Beagle explored and was tasked. Fitzroy was tasked with mapping the channels around the Straits of Magellan and the southern tip of South America, because sailing trade and the expansion of the British Empire was so important. A knowledge of rocks and of the coasts and how ships could go and where they could go was vital. So that was what Fitzroy was tasked to do. But there's an interesting little spot down a very remote part in southern, down in a valley overlooking the Straits of Magellan. There's a cross, rather obscurely, just up in there, and it's one of the most significant it's one of the most significant landmarks in the whole history of our thinking of mankind, I think, because in that grave is buried a man called Pringle Stokes. Now, Pringle Stokes was the captain of the Beagle, who was sent first of all to map around Tierra del Fuego in that area. It was such an arduous task that he eventually it wore him down completely, and he actually committed suicide. He died from the effects of the effect of anxieties and the hardships incurred while serving in the western shores of Tierra del Fuego on the 12th of August 1828. So Pringle Stokes took his life, but the British government decided they still wanted the surveying to continue, and they decided to appoint Captain Fitzroy to go down and take over the Beagle. Fitzroy said he wanted to take a companion with him, and he took Charles Darwin. And a lot of our understanding of biology and everything is founded on what Darwin found during that his time around Tierra del Fuego, and a lot of our knowledge of it is based on Darwin's writing. it's down there. That's in the Southern Andes, just some of the areas that Darwin would have seen in the 1830s, and it's those sort of sites that he saw that gave him the idea of how the Earth was formed and how, of course, the process of evolution started. So a lot of, I mean, there are plants named after him down in Tierra del Fuego in Patagonia, the Darwin Range, Mount Darwin in just above Ushuaia. So there is a huge influence and memory of the fact that Darwin had in the area. And that's just some of the paintings in the channels of by Conrad Martins, who was on the Beagle, of the Indians in there. And Darwin was particularly interested by how people managed to survive under those fairly poor conditions that there were down there, or those hazardous conditions. And that's another famous painting he did of them in the Beagle Narrows. About that time as well, the 1850s, the Patagonian Missionary Society, a British society founded in England, decided that they, in the sort of Victorian tradition, they wanted to try and Christianize these peoples, these Indians living under such poor conditions in southern Tierra del Fuego and southern Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. So they sent down a group of missionaries who all starved to death, actually, under Captain Allen Gardner. And this, on the shores of the Beagle Channel, and this got huge public sympathy back in Britain, how these poor men had gone down and had been so hard just to survive in that difficult environment, that they decided they would try and get a base where they could actually live and take Indians to and sort of evangelize them and then send them back into their own society. And they decided to do that in the Falkland Islands. And that was where there's a link between southern Patagonia and a very close link. So the Falklands, which was, that they could safely reach, was about 250 miles away, but it was much more amenable climate, and there were British peoples living there then, and there was a farm. So they established, the British government gave them an island, Keppel Island, on the Falklands, and there they established the mission station. They brought Indians from Tierra del Fuego across to Keppel Island and educated them and taught them how to live and stuff there, and then took them back to their own peoples as a sort of an experiment, if you like. Whether you agreed with that or not, it was the way they operated at that time. And they founded the South American Missionary Society, and that operated till about the early 1900s. And the station they had on Keppel Island in the Falklands is still, the remains of that are still there, and that's, historically, it's one of the oldest buildings on the Falklands, because Falklands were only colonised in 1766. So it was, the links were very close at that time. And that's what remains really of the mission station on Keppel. So it's a very significant historic site, and I was always interested in that. The Uttermost Part of the Earth was the book that was written, which describes that, how that was set up. And I was always very interested in seeing, because I'd lived on Keppel actually for a while, I had experiments and trials on Keppel Island. I was always interested in seeing the sites in Patagonia that were linked to that. And some of these here, Viamonte, Harberton, which was the first European house. Eventually the missionaries then moved and actually started to farm and have their own settlements, based from Keppel originally, but then their own places on down in Tierra del Fuego, and I'll talk about that later. So the first European to live on Tierra del Fuego was Thomas Bridges, who was a missionary who was sort of brought up on Keppel Island. He was an orphan. He was an orphan actually, who was found under a bridge in Bristol, and the family that found him called him Bridges. That's why he came. And the whole Bridges family have colonised a good chunk of Tierra del Fuego, and he built a farm at Harberton, which today is still there. And it's the first European house that was built on Tierra del Fuego. And that's worth going. I mean, tourists who really want to get to the ends of the earth, when you're down there, it is very worth seeing that site at Harberton. It's a beautiful area. You have the Andes Mountains up behind you, and you're right down on the slopes on the straits of the Beagle Channel. And just a few shots from around Harberton. It is accommodation, it is a restaurant, and a very fine whale museum in it. One of the Bridges family, several generations down, who married an American scientist who Natalie Goodall, who established a whale museum in that area. So it's an area worth seeing. Then thinking once again sort of the historic links and you find it in Patagonia, and everything's spaced out. Patagonia has got space. Everywhere you go there's huge room. And I mean, this is just landscapes with you see nobody for hundreds of kilometres. You drive a lot around roads. And last year, I'm just thinking back a bit to link it into some of the times we were. But we were driving, and this is the part of Argentine, Tierra del Fuego, and we suddenly sort of came down into in the bend of a river, and there was a sort of a hotel. Old hotel was something very popular for travellers on the way. It's on the famous Patagonia Route 40, which is the road that goes between Chile and Argentina. Went into the hotel, and it was a shop, a restaurant, and a small museum. And then suddenly I have a great interest in westerns. That's sort of always watched Western film. And there on the wall, of course, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had actually been to that place whenever they came to buy sheep. I mean, they were real people, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they did go down to Southern Patagonia, and they actually stayed there. So that's a bit of history too. And then also in Punta Arenas, there's if you're interested in Irish polar history and Irish polar explorers, there still is the old jetty where Shackleton's, after his men had been rescued and they were brought back to Chile, this is where they landed here, just at that part of Punta Arenas, and it's a famous. So there's a lot of history, interesting history in the area. So let's just look a bit at sort of some of the landscapes and scenery, the broad range there is. I'm just going to use as an example the island of Chiloé up in the top of Chile there, which is pretty much near the top of Patagonia, and just compare that with sort of Punta Arenas in the south, just the range and scope that you have. Up around Chiloé, which is really sort of south central Chile, is the area where the most active volcanoes are in all that region. And that's quite a good Mediterranean type climate. It's where it's not quite the wine growing area, that's a bit further north where it's a bit drier and warmer, but it is still good farmland, and it's got a lot of history of particularly Yugoslavian people going out there and Germans who colonized out there and developed good farms and so on. And it's an area of lakes, and it's really a sort of a touristy area, if you like. It's called the lake. It's the Lake District is what they actually do call it there, and it's like here. It's lush, it's green, it's pretty wet, and so on. And they say you have plenty of mountains and spectacular scenery. And then the end of Chiloé, which is a big island just off that area, is really a lovely place to go. I was struck how like Ireland as it was, because I see when I did that a Land Rover trip back up through South America, I had been in the Falklands for 3 years, and I drove, I'll mention that later, just to go over, and it was spring, and there were daffodils at the side of the roads and so on. And Chiloé is just a lovely area. It's about the same size roughly as, it's a bit smaller than Northern Ireland in total, but it's mostly woods, and it's a small population, and it's a very traditional farming, fishing and forestry way of life on the island, and it still seems to be in the past. It's not taken over by a lot of modern developments and everything. You could still see something like this with a cart and a cattle in a cart, and I still saw a man ploughing with horses there. Those are goalposts behind him in a football field, what I saw at the time. And there's still milk creamery cans at the end of the road, just to be collected. So this and wood, everything was made of wood and timber, and this is just on the island of Chilean. Chileans, obviously, with their coast, depend very much on the sea. They eat a lot of fish, they eat a lot of seafood, and they make a lot of use of seaweeds and the produce from the sea. And there's a huge fishing industry in the islands. These are just some of the fishing villages that were on Chilean. They're like almost on stilts around the coast because there's sort of the land's quite steep in the back. And you get the famous spider crabs, which are Santoja, which are very good eating. And in the market, just all those there are just like rhubarb, but it's kelp, seaweeds and bundles that people buy and use to cook and all. So they make a lot of use of the sea and the produce from the sea. And in any market, you'll see that huge range of sea products. And a small shipbuilding industry on the island from timber. Chile has a lot of forests, and most of these forests have been bought up by the Japanese, so there's a lot of concern over that in Chile. It's an issue. But there's a lot of this tradition of making wood and wooden houses and making things in wood. And some of the buildings, the old historic buildings, are these churches, for instance, lovely design. They're all scalloped wood and all made in wood, and the shingles are made of wood. Then when you get further down through Patagonia to the south, to the Punta Arenas, which is the southern city. It's a big city now, it's nearly 90,000 odd people, a bit bigger. And it has gradually developed because that's quite a prosperous region, good sheep farming area, a big British influence in the 19th century. A lot of British farmers went out and French as well. And there's a lot of more wealth in that southern part of Chile than there is in the whole middle, really, just because of the fact that it was a good area for farming, good area for sheep farming. And it's right on the Straits of Magellan, so still a lot of shipping goes around. I mean, whenever the Panama Canal was built in the 1860s, that sort of killed the shipping industry in the Falklands and killed a lot of the industry in southern South America. But gradually, as the Panama Canal got more expensive and difficult, shipping has now started to go back around South America again, rather than through there. And so Punta Arenas is now quite an important port, and there's oil and gas down there too. So alongside, as you drive along the shores of the Straits of Magellan, you come across many areas where you can see the evidence of abandoned ships and of the difficulties of sailing and of shipping in that area. Those are just some of those wrecks that are along the coastline there. And you have a reflection of the sheep farming industry. Fine statue there is in Punta Arenas. And these are the sort of grasslands which would remind us here of the hills of Donegal and the Sperrins and so on, of coarse grasslands where people are farming, mainly for sheep in that type of climate. Further up in Patagonia, where it's much, much drier, the grassland is much poorer. So that's why just down in the south you have an area where it's a bit moister and better. So let's sort of look at some of the landscapes there are across the range of Patagonia. There's obviously a big coastline, and then there's the drier plains and the mountains, right down to Tierra del Fuego at the bottom. And there's just a few shots of the range of landscape you get in Tierra del Fuego, and just some pictures of some of the wildlife there are in that sort of central part of Patagonia. Some of the traditional sheep farming on the farmer on his horse. They still gather sheep on horseback, and a traditional farmhouse out in that area. Very lonely, isolated place. And some of the wildlife there, the type of ostrich, the nandu, the rhea, and the guanaco, which I'll show you a bit more about in a minute. But the coastal part of Patagonia is interesting because it has whales and so on around. I never managed to see them there, but it has a lot of penguins as well. Even though it's it's temperate climate, but it's close to up to the Antarctic. You have Magellanic penguins can be found right around the coast, and they live up on grassland. They burrow into the ground. They're never near the ice, so there are about 16 different types of penguins. Only 3 or 4 of them are actually found on ice in Antarctica. A lot of them live on islands and grasslands and things like that, and then just go to sea. You have South American fur seals are also found right around the coast of Patagonia on the coast, and southern sea lions. So there is the coastal waters are very rich in wildlife, and you get a big diversity. Then you get birds like the skuas, and a lot of lakes and a very indented coastline, very very dramatic. Then the largest area really are these plains, grassland plains, which eventually become the pampas further north. But the pampas are much better grassland; they're much more nutritious, so they're not part of Patagonia. The pampas grasslands is where the climate is better and you have more grass. The Patagonian plains are really like this, just scrub grasses. As I say, it would look like a lot of our hills and uplands and scenery like that, and really just remote and expansive. There's a farm gate here. That road just vanishes. It goes for miles and miles before you probably get to a house somewhere at the end of it. It's a long way to go. And you have then where you get near the mountains, the plains merge into the southern beech forest in that area as well. And the farmhouse again, sorry, I showed you that earlier. Rheas, these are Darwin's rhea. He named them first. They're like a species of ostrich. They'll wander in flocks across across these plains. They're not as big as an ostrich or an emu, but they are one of the biggest birds in South America, are land-based birds. So it's a lovely sight to see them there. There's just one of them there. And you have hares as well, Patagonian hare, very like our hare, but it's a bigger sort of bird. And a lot of waterfowl, ducks, geese, upland geese here. Many similar species that are found in the Falklands and that area, because they've migrated across there and inhabited there, and those are just upland geese living around the ponds and in the grasslands. Family there, a female, and the geese chicks. Flamingos, quite surprising. The further you get right down to South America, flamingos, there are a couple of species of flamingo which are quite common, and you tend to think they're more as an exotic bird of warm climes, but no, they live eating the little shrimps in the ponds down in the grasslands that's right down in Tierra, Fuego there. And if we look, but the most spectacular landscapes and scenery in Patagonia are the mountains, because the Andes Mountains just form that spine right down the whole of the back, if you like, of Patagonia, and they're just an amazing. They've been pushed up by tectonic plates, gradually pushing the rocks up into these dramatic, sharp peaks, and the Torresdale Pine group right down the Pine Towers, if you like, right down to the tip of southern Patagonia, are the most dramatic, and it's where most tourists who go down there try to get to see. That's them in the middle of that group of 3 or 4 mountains, which just you wonder just how they managed to stay up there, and or how anybody managed to ever climb them. And that's another side of the Torresdale Pine group. The water, there's a lot of copper in the rocks and there, so the water tends to be a very green colour, but there's quite a lot of ice floating around in it too, and there are glaciers, but these spectacular mountain ranges just coming out of the colour. And that's the 3 piney towers, as they are in the middle there. and they're the real, where people want to go, try and go and see and get to see. It's a bit of a walk to get up to them. If you get to the bottom, you're doing well. You're not going to go much farther. There are people have climbed them, I do believe, but they are certainly quite hard to get to, and but they're worth. You can walk right up on to the base of them and the lake and stuff. And that's just some more of the mountains in Southern Andes. The highest mountain in the Southern Andean range is Fitzroy. Well, sorry, there's also a good place to see glaciers around there. Glaciers, okay, you get them in Greenland, you get them in Europe, in certain alpine areas, but they're not always easy for people to get to actually up front to see glaciers and to get at them. And Southern Patagonia is a good place to do that. This is Glacier Grey in southern in Torres del Paine area, where you still have to get a boat to go up and actually go up to the face of the glacier, which you can do, and it's some of the most spectacular things we've ever seen have been just going up to actually see those glaciers. They're amazing, and I'll talk a bit about them a bit later on. You can see just how it is a spectacular sight, and to hear the creaking and crunching of them as you go up near them. Fitzroy Mountain is the tallest mountain in Southern Patagonia. You can see it there right in the middle of that group, Cerro Fitzroy, the Fitzroy Hill. And there's one dead-end road that goes right up into the Andes. This is an Argentine part of the Andes. The piney towers and the Torres del Paine are in the Chilean sector. This is in the Argentine sector, and there's a little village, El Calten. You can just see it tucked in. Sorry, my cursor doesn't work. Right in the top.
It's going around somewhere.
It's going on the roof. It doesn't seem to go on to here. Maybe it goes on here. Anyway, no matter. It's tucked in just below the mountains. So that's Fitzroy Mountain itself. There are a couple of people who have climbed it, I believe, famous mountaineers. It's quite a challenge. A Frenchman, anyway, has climbed all of the peaks right there. So that's sort of the most, that landscape goes right up the whole side for about 2,000 miles, and most of it's completely unpopulated. There's no one lives in there. There's no road between southern Chile and northern. To get from the south of Chile to the northern part of Chile, you have to go into Argentina and then back into Chile again, just because it's such a remote and difficult area to live in. Then some of the wildlife that's associated with those mountains, very spectacular. The guanaco are really the main grazers in those grasslands, and they live just up in the high Andes there, and they're a beautiful sight to see. They're large numbers of them, they're very tame. You get further north, you get vicuña, which are found further up in the Andes, not in the Patagonian bit, and they're obviously famous for their fine wool and so on. And those are just guanaco and grazing in the slopes just up of the mountains in the southern Patagonia, and the chilengo or a guanaco, young guanaco cub, I think it's called. Sure, chilengo in Spanish, and some interesting birds. The buff-necked ibis, which is very common there, and of course condors, quite famous. The largest of the eagles, which just fly up in the peaks of the Andes, and they are a sight, really a terrific sight to see. There's a fox, Patagonian fox, like ours, who's quite common, and there are quite a range of specific flora you find in the region. Lovely, just a couple of the plants that you see there. I'm not going to go through lots of them, but this is Calceolaria darwinii, which is named after Darwin. It's called the lady's slippers. It's a common name, but it's he who named it, one of the Calceolarias. So the environmental issues that sort of facing Patagonia at the minute, really, climate change is the biggest one. Really, because of the effect it's having on, it's drying out the grasslands in the summer, and that's a big problem in the Falklands, which a lot of my work has been dealing with. But the other is affecting the glaciers, because the glaciers all along that mountain range, they're starting to melt, really, and that's of great concern to people, because of the floods it creates, or just simply because of the big effect on the habitats and the birds and creatures that live there. For example, Lago Grey, which is the one I mentioned first, we went there first in 2007 to see it, and it was quite a, it's a sort of a go-to place, really, to get up to. It's quite hard to get up to. It's 250 kilometres north of Punta Arenas, and you have to drive up into it, and then there's a nice hotel you can stay, and that's the glaciers away up in the valley there, and then you can get a boat up into it from there. So, but it is a place you can actually go and stay and look at glaciers, so it's quite impressive. And this is just us heading up, I think, to enjoy the trips that go up there, and it's one of the things to do in southern Patagonia, if you get to try and get up to see the glaciers, Glacier Grey. So that was it, just a bit of it in 2007. We've been there in 2019, and just quite shocked to see that how the ice had retreated, and I put those two bits together. Mm-hmm. That rock outcrop had been covered over by ice well in 2007, and it had now retreated, back around, and that was an outcrop sticking out, and that was fairly obvious just being there. The official figure is that glaciers retreated by about 100 metres between those 10 and 12 years. So that's just the rate of melt that's going on. Against that, there are some other very, very interesting glaciers. Perito Moreno Glacier in Argentina, which is just a bit further north in Torres del Paine, is one of the few glaciers in the world that's actually growing. Now that it's still melting, but it's actually still going. It's actually growing a bit faster than it's melting. But it is a tremendous sight as well worth going to see, because it's fairly accessible. You can actually walk there's a nice walkway and so on around here where you can go around and you can actually view the glacier itself. You can go up quite close to it on that and see it right up front, and you can actually round the walk where you're just right up facing into the glacier, and it's just coming right down that valley. And it's quite a touristy place. People go there. It's still not like the Costa del Sol or anything like that. It's still difficult enough place to get to near El Calafate. Another environmental issue: beavers. The beavers were introduced to Tierra del Fuego in 1940s. They were farmed. They were introduced from Europe, and eventually, whenever the beaver farming was no longer profitable, they just let them all go, and now they're just destroying huge areas of forest in that southern forest in Tierra del Fuego and Southern Patagonia. So that's maybe a lesson just to how what the effect of an alien species can have on an area when you do see a lot of obvious beaver damage in the forest there. There's not a huge, there's a lot of tourists who go there to southern South America, to Patagonia. The numbers do increase in the summer, obviously, but it's not excessive. It's not a place that you would say it's overrun with tourists. It's not easy to get to, it's all right if somebody's paying your way to go to the Falklands every year. Then you can just take a bit of a detour and go to Patagonia. But there's not a huge issue, and they are just trying to encourage more tourists. Fires are a big risk. It's getting drier, and those grasslands and those woodlands, there's been some huge forest fires. They're probably accidentally lit by campers and tourists. They're an area of concern, forest fires, but they still do encourage tourism. There's plenty of accommodation at all levels, and it's once you're living there and so on, it's cheaper than here. It's well worth a go. I think sort of getting around near the end now, maybe I'm run over my time. Thinking about my times in Patagonia, so I first went there in 1978 when I left the Falklands, and and I'd been there for 3 years, sort of setting up the agriculture research station. And I took the Land Rover myself. Wife and child took a Land Rover, and with another family, we spent 6 months driving up through South America. Decided to try and get back to Northern Ireland the slow way. And then that's all right. I got back home. That was great, and settled down in Northern Ireland. Got a job with the Department of Agriculture, and put all the good lectures that Dr. Faulkner had given me on grass into practice. And but then the Falklands War came along. I didn't think I'd ever get back to the Falklands, because I really loved it. It was great. But then 1982, the war came along. In 1983, as Dave said, I got the chance to go back down, and that's been 50 times now. But after 5 or 6 years, sort of by the mid 1980s, we started to try and form links with an agriculture university in Punta Arenas, because it was pointless Falkland Island children, if they wanted to go to college or agricultural college, university, to send them back to England, which was not easy, and then bring them back to the Falklands. Whereas if we could get, and the links between Chile and the Falklands were very good, and it was a good place to link up in terms of research and so on. So we set up a link with the University of Magallanes through Queen's University in Belfast, and through that, fortunately, I was able to make quite a lot of visits to Patagonia, and then we started to spend a bit, whenever I retired, and spend a bit more time to go down there. But one of the most memorable ones was in 2020. Whenever we were in Patagonia, whenever COVID struck, we didn't really know much about it, because COVID wasn't big news down in the Falklands in the 5 weeks we'd been there before. And so I'll just finish off with a wee bit about that adventure that we had in Patagonia in 2020. Just to come back to working in the Falklands, and that's the sort of journey, Land Rover journey, took going back through South America, and spent 6 months driving around Patagonia and a bit further north up through Chile and in southern Bolivia and to Brazil. That's the story in itself. It was quite an exciting time, I suppose, when you look back on it. Just taking a short wheelbase Land Rover through the plains of South America and up through the Andes, but it was good character building, I suppose. Probably foolhardy when you look at it, but anyway, I just looking at an old picture. That was my Land Rover there crossing the Straits of Magellan in 1978. The tent just folded up on top of the Land Rover, and then in 2020 when we're down, there's a much plusher crossing as you would cross the Straits. But we sort of I put together a talk for there were 3 of us. Our friend Joe O'Farrell from Wicklow, who came with us, and we'd been staying in the Falklands for 5 weeks, and we'd planned to finish off our trip. This was in 2020, in March 2020. We planned to finish off the 3 weeks in southern Patagonia, going to see the Shackleton sites and sites of the missionary settlements there that I talked to you about earlier. So our plan was to visit that grave of Pringle Stokes, the one that I showed you, this one, the hell, which I'd seen before, but I wanted to show to Joe. And then go right down to Woollaya, which was a remote island near Cape Horn, where there'd been a massacre of some of the missionaries by, not the first group, by some of the Indians that they brought back from Keppel Island. And there's a lot of controversy about it and what happened and all that. And so it's quite a historic site, and it's where the whole missionary effort sort of changed its direction a bit. And also to visit Harberton again and Viamonte, which were 2 of the Bridges families' housing. So those are the sites we wanted to go to. We flew across to Punta Arenas. There's a once weekly flight between the Falklands and Punta Arenas on Saturday. And then we went there and we hired a car and we went down. We picked up an Argentinian friend of mine, Enrique, who's an agronomist, who had helped with some trials and some research with him in South America. We went to Viamonte Farm, which was one of the Bridges brothers' farms, and it's still preserved very much as the old farm, as a sort of museum and farm museum and store. And then we went on down through Tierra del Fuego, planning to get down to down across from Ushuaia onto Isla Navarino, from where we would get down to our destination on Woollaya, that island. There's a lot of planning and so on to get to that. We crossed the Beagle Channel from Ushuaia to Puerto Navarino, and there on the boat, people asked us to put on masks. What's going on here? This was really first we had ever heard that really this COVID, but we're now into early mid-March, and it was the first we'd heard that this COVID business was actually starting to get serious worldwide. But then I just put on the masks and we went on across, and I was in touch with my travel agent, the lady in Falklands who booked my fares and booked all our stuff, and she started telling us, look, flights are starting to get disrupted. But anyway, we went on to Puerto Williams, which is on Isla Navarino, and there we saw some of the links with the mission on Keppel Island, because some of the missionaries there who built a house there, and the massacre at Woollaya, which we wanted to see that. And at the top there, Plaza Bernardo O'Higgins. Bernardo O'Higgins was the founder really of Chile, if you like. He was the one who liberated Chile liberated what became Chile from the Spaniards, and he was from County Mayo, or his father was from County Mayo. So there's an Irish connection there between that and Patagonia. We got right down to Woollaya, where the cove there that we wanted to get to, and it's very historically, it's hard to get to. We had to sort of hire a boatman to take us the last bit through the Murray Narrows and things, and it was interesting to compare the painting of Conrad Martin's, the one I showed you, which he'd done in 1833, and it was absolutely flat calm the day we went through, which was lovely. And then in Button Sound, where we went right down to Woollaya, it's named after Jemmy Button, who was one of the Indians that Fitzroy had taken back to London, to Britain, to meet the King. So that was the very furthest south I've ever been, where you're not far. Cape Horn is just over the hill there. That's the furthest south I'd ever been. So it was quite good. It was a good feeling to get there. But we realised we'd better start thinking we'd get back home again, what was going on. We got back over to Ushuaia and collected our car again, which we left there, and started to head back up to get back into Chile again, where we were due to fly from and we'd hired our car from. And then we were just getting news reports that, look, Argentina is probably going to close the country down for Europeans. We even thought at the time, well, why don't we just stay down there? Sure, it was over. We know people there who we could stay with, and that would be quite nice. But we eventually realised that we'd run out of time, and our Argentinian friend said, look, the news is getting bad, you should really leave. So we were planning to stay in Rio Grande, and he said to us, which is about 150 miles from the border, he said that they're going to make an announcement at 8 o'clock that evening about lockdown, and he said they're going to close the country at midnight. So we dashed up to and crossed the border back into Chile so that we could get back to get our flights home. It was all sort of last minute stuff. Looking back on it, was pretty exciting. And we never forget, we managed to get across the Chilean border into Chile. There's a wee sort of cafe there, and we had a meal in it. And still, we were just so relaxed that we had actually got over there. By now it was the 17th of March, and our messages from home were getting worrying, so we left, flew on 19th of March, and then I think 20th of March was lockdown started officially in Ireland, wasn't it then? And I remember after I left Enrique in Argentina, he said, remember you thought of staying here in March? Well, the local news from today is that the hospital and private health system in Tierra del Fuego is completely collapsed. So that was it. Glad we'd gone. So we finally left from Punta Arenas, flew north, and we arrived in to Heathrow and there wasn't a soul in the airport. It was weird. We got back to an Ireland that we could not have conceived of. Just couldn't go anywhere, you couldn't do anything, and we got home by the skin of our teeth. But so that was certainly the most exciting adventure we had in Patagonia. And just to finish off with a little mention of the Hacklet Society, which Dave is a member of, and I'm a member of. It's really a society that encourages. It was founded in 1846 to promote the study of historical exploration, global travel, and cultural exchange. It's named after Richard Hakluyt, who was a Elizabethan collector and sailor. But their main function is to they collect the logbooks and the diaries of all these famous sailors from Captain Cook and all these expeditions, and they get them translated, they get them put into published, annotated, corrected, published, and with scholarly research put them all together. So any sort of obscure travels, particularly in areas like Patagonia, if you really want to get into a bit of depth about what has been discovered, what was discovered in those early expeditions, and they don't just do, they do overland travels, and every year you get 1 or 2 books from them. You take what you get, you pay just a fee at the beginning of the year, and a lot of them happen to be, about sailing travel, particularly about a lot of Captain Cook's, all his officers' diaries have now been annotated and published through the Hakluyt Society, and a lot of the stuff in Patagonia. So I have shelves of all these blue bound books. I don't know what I'll do with some of them, but some of them are really good to keep. And if you want to find any more about it, I'm supposed to be the Irish representative, and I'll give you a card afterwards if you want. But for example, there's a couple that come out relatively recently. The Armada in the Straits, and the voyage of Captain John Narborough in the Strait of Magellan, and in His Majesty's ship 1869, blah blah. So his logbooks and diaries would land just somewhere in the Admiralty or something. If someone took them out and annotated them properly and got them into a form to be published, and that's what the Hakluyt Society does. So, thanks anyway. That's just a tour de force round of my and our experiences anyway in Patagonia. So, thank you.